Hello, visual storytellers. Guess what? It's the last lecture of the semester. And today's lecture is about Gestalt theory. It's the kind of information that will help you to understand more about how the brain works so that designers can take advantage of the brain's tendencies to do better design. Look at this fuzzy image. What do you see? Well, I imagine most of you saw a cube. But think about how that cube has been formed simply by creating negative spaces or white spaces in the black circles. But here's what your eye is doing. There are no lines connecting. There's no line connecting these circles, and yet we see a cube. Well, that is a function of the brain's tendency to continue lines. Once they see something moving in a direction, we fill in. Our brain intuitively, if things are done the right way, fills in the information. You're not going to be tested on history, but just to give you a little background. Gestalt theory grew out of Gestalt psychology, which was developed in the early 1900s by two psychologists, German psychologists, excuse me, Max Wertheimer and Kurt Koppe. They created a theory out of Gestalt psychology that is the theory of Gestalt visual perception. The central principle of Gestalt psychology is that the mind forms a global whole with self-organizing principles. Now, how this was used in psychology was that when therapists, Gestalt theory said that if you work with a patient, that if a patient has an issue, what they're trying to do is solve that problem. And by solving that problem, if you can organize, right? If you can organize the things that are causing the issues for that person into a coherent whole, then you can help them solve their problem. They came to understand that the brain is also wants to organize things visually. And Gestalt is important because it gives you reliable, proven psychological basis for organizing information or visual information if you're a designer. And I'm going to give you a lot of examples about how that works. So here is basic Gestalt. And this kind of a mantra, the whole is something different than the sum of its parts, has been used ever since Gestalt visual psychology was developed by designers to understand how the brain works. So let's think about that for a minute. The whole is something different than the sum of its parts. The whole exists independently of the parts. So an example, if you're going to sew a shirt, you've got pieces of fabric, right? But when you sew those pieces of fabric together to make a shirt, now the whole that is the shirt is something different, and it's actually more than just the individual parts put together. So the whole is something different than just the sum of the individual parts. I created this cat out of a Q, an O, and two triangles. So individually, we see a Q, an O, and two triangles. Together, they are different though than just putting those parts together. They are rearranged visually, so now that they are something different than the individual parts. Gestalt explains how the eye and brain organize elements into patterns and patterns into a whole. We call this the click factor. When you look at something and it just clicks into the thing that it is. All the pieces are there and in the right place at the right time, and it forms a click. There is a limit to the amount of information that the brain can keep track of. When the amount of visual information becomes too great, the mind tries to simplify it by grouping it. So that's what I said. The brain wants to organize elements to manage the elements that it's seeing. So groups are formed in logical ways based on what the information looks like and where things are located. Look at this word whole. When you look at the word whole, you're perceiving a word. First, that's what your brain sees. Now, of course, this is cultural. This is what we see in English because when you understand English and read English, you're recognizing words and not individual letters. Can you imagine how long it would take to read something if you had to put the letters together every single time you looked at a word to make that word? Over time, our brain gets better and better at organizing those letters so that what we see is the individual words instinctively without having to think about it. Now, if we read an unfamiliar word or we don't know how to pronounce a word, we may look at the individual letters to sound it out. So this is the brain trying to make sense of information. But when it's information we understand, like the word whole, we see it. We see it without seeing the individual letters. So, and another thing, I have intentionally put space between these letters. If I put too much space between the letters, you would no longer recognize them as a word. So it's about how those letters are connected and organized with space between words that enables the brain to organize that information and see that a word is more than the sum of its individual parts. Here are the basic principles of Gestalt, and I do want you to be able to have just a simple understanding of each one. On the quiz, I am very likely to give you some of these examples and ask you to identify which Gestalt principle it exhibits. Now understand though, that most design exhibits more than one principle, but usually there's one that you can most predominantly identify, and I'm not going to give you something so crazy hard that you can't do it. We have figure ground, similarity, proximity, continuation, and closure. So I'm going to go through each one of these now with examples. Figure and ground. The principle of figure and ground. So the figure is what you notice. In this case, the dachshund. The ground is everything else. So you could say that the figure is what stands out to you, and then the ground is the background, or the figure is the positive space, and the ground is the negative space or the background. The next image I'm going to show you, oh, no, it's not an image yet. Sorry about that. So figure-ground relationship can be intentionally blurred, and artists have used figure ground to play with viewers' perceptions. But the Gestalt principle also says that when a smaller shape is surrounded by a larger uniform area, we perceive that smaller object to be in front and to have a border. I'm going to give you a classic example of this in a second. Now, the next slide I'm going to show you. Look at it. I'm going to hold it for a second and think to yourself, what do you see? What image stands out to you? Now, if we were live in class, I would ask you, how many of you saw a vase first? Are you raising your hand right now? And then I would ask, how many people saw two faces first? Now, if you didn't see the faces, look at it again, and you're going to see the faces. And then your eyes or your brain is going to switch back and forth between a face and a vase, faces and vases. This is a classic example. It's called the Rubens vase, created by Edgar Rubin in 1915. But it's the classic example of Gestalt principle of figure ground and how you can blur it in a way that kind of messes with people's minds. And now we have this example. Now I'm guessing a lot of you, maybe all of you, know what the visual trick is here. That visual trick, however, you probably didn't know, is a result of figure ground Gestalt theory. Now remember, I said Gestalt shows that a smaller object, when it's surrounded by a solid color, creates a kind of bounding box. We see that as an object. Now, if you know what it is, you know what it is. If you don't know what it is, look at this for a second and see if you can figure out what the visual trick is. Now think for a second, if you're trying to figure it out. FedEx, right? FedEx does what? It moves merchandise. It moves packages. Now can you see it? What represents moving packages? Well, what represents moving packages is an arrow. Now, this is brilliant design. And I don't know the history of who designed it, or maybe I've known it at one point, but I don't know it anymore. Designing this required finding the right typeface so that the X and the E, so those letters connected in a way that created an arrow. Now, probably the letters didn't do this perfectly on their own, and it may be that the X had to be stretched or changed a little bit to make that connection. FedEx is in a typeface. I don't know for sure which one, but it looks very much like a typeface called Futura. And I haven't tried to do this myself in Futura to see if I can create this. How do you think the designer arrived at this? Well, I can tell you, I doubt it was on the first pass, but people who are trained in Gestalt and are trained in design, sometimes these things will just pop in their heads, or they will just see things. I have a tendency to do that. I have a tendency to see, for example, faces in things. Look at a light, look at an electrical socket, right? There's a face there. So I'm always kind of making those visual connections. And over time, you get better and better at making those visual connections. Then we have similarity. Similarity says that objects placed together that are similar to each other are perceived as a single unit. I have notes on this one because I don't want to go off track, which I am so easily inclined to do. So objects placed together that are similar to each other are perceived as a single unit. What does that look like? The next slide, what do you see? You see you see vertically, right? You see rows of squares and rows of black dots. Notice how you have to make your brain work. You have to work mentally to see a square, a dot, a square, a dot, a square, a dot, right? But you don't have to work at all. You automatically, intuitively see these columns. This is the principle of similarity. What does this mean in design? Well, in design, it just means that if you place type together that looks similar, it's going to form a unit. If you use photos of the same shape and place them together, they're going to form a unit. You can create similarity 3 ways: with size, shape, and color. Here we've got bigger size, and so we group the larger squares and circles. We see those as prominent and as a unit. In the smaller one, we visually group them, or in the next one, we visually group them by shape. And in the last one, we visually group them by color. Now, this shows you a little more what you can do with design. You want things to be grouped, you make them the same size. If you want attention drawn to certain parts of your design, even if they're spread out, like let's say headings in your infographic where you've got a bunch of little headings, if you make them all the same color, the brain will intuitively understand that those headings are headings and that they represent the same thing. So your brain groups them. Here's a wonderful example of similarity being used in an ad. Absolute Vodka had a series of brilliant ads, and I encourage you to Google Absolute Vodka ads to see. You'll see many examples of the way artists created vodka bottles in art different ways. In this, we have a perfect example of similarity, right? We have a whole bunch of yellow cabs in the shape of a vodka bottle. And we see that vodka bottle because all of those yellow cabs are yellow and they're the same size. Instantly, we understand that that's a bottle. Also, it helps that there's a title that says Absolute, so we know it's a vodka bottle, but we can see the bottle. Similarity in design. Sometimes similarity works because it makes us focus on what is different. And I do want you to know what this is. This is called anomaly. So our brain groups these, but our brain pays attention to this because it's different. And then we have the principle of proximity. Now, your book author has talked about this. We've talked about, did a lecture on this, and we've talked about this in class. But the book author's principle of proximity is based on Gestalt theory. Objects that are closer together are perceived as a group. Now, in this case, I'm showing you same-size squares. So you might be thinking, well, isn't this similarity? Well, yes and no. The point of this is, though, I could have things of different sizes and place them together, and visually, I would still group them. Here's another example. Your brain organizes these into 2 separate columns of dots, not 4 columns of dots, because of the space. Now, you remember I talked in my lecture on proximity about how white space is integral to creating proximity. And here is that principle in action. There's white space between the columns, and that white space is creating these 2 columns, 2 separate visual columns that we see made out of the same shape, black circles. But here it is, not at play in this headline. And I keep hammering home on this because I really want you to understand this when you design your infographic. If you space all the text on your page out evenly, the brain will not be able to understand it as well as it can if things are grouped together. So you need to have your headings with the related text. And a reminder of what especially helps proximity to work is space. If you have everything sort of evenly spaced, then the brain, even though if visually you have designed it because you know what goes with what, the viewer or reader's brain will not understand that. There's a tendency in infographics, because the screen is not as big as it would be if you printed it out, to kind of think things look smaller than they actually are. But what you need to know is you want to create, you see my hands here, units of things where the things that are related to each other go together and there's more space between them. It could be a gutter. It can just be space. But you want to use space to create relationships between the things that go together. So we have this example in which we have proximity. Here you recognize this as a subhead that explains the title because it is close to the title. And here we have another example from art. Proximity. So you could also say, well, this is similarity. And yes, it is. It's both proximity and similarity. Instead of perceiving this as 15 little flying men, we see a tree. Our mind tells us it's a tree, right? But it's similar because all of these little flying men are more or less the same. But here's the thing. A designer could have done this with different elements, and I'm going to show you an example in the next slide. And still the proximity of those elements creates a unit. And here we are. An old IKEA ad. I don't think you would buy this at IKEA anymore, but it's really well done, right? So these elements are all dissimilar, but because they're placed together, we recognize the shape of the United States. It's a big country. Someone's got to furnish it. Great tagline, by the way. Next, we have continuation. With continuation, so when the eye starts looking in a particular direction, it will keep looking in that direction. Just like when you're reading this text, you start reading along that line and your eye keeps moving to the end of the line. So it will keep looking in that direction until it stops or something interrupts it. The features built into typography, since we are taught to read left to right in our culture. In Chinese, the continuation would go from right to left. So once you start reading, you continue to, you will cross a gap to the next words. Now, if I had these next words way, far away from, off this screen, you wouldn't make that leap. But you will make the leap if the space isn't too big. Because when the eye starts moving in a direction, it wants to keep moving in that direction. See? Where does your eye go? From the arrow to the dot, and from the pointing finger to the square, even though there's a really big gap between there. So if you create a headline across the top of a page, your eye, the viewer's eye, is going to follow that headline. If you put half the headline at the top of the page and half the headline at the bottom, something in the middle is breaking that. Your eye, even though you know that the headline starts there and finishes there, the viewer will not get that. They will have to work mentally hard to connect the second half of the title with the first half of the title. There are three ways that we get eye direction. I'm sorry, continuation. Eye direction, perspective, and paths. Leonardo da Vinci made designing the Last Supper is in this is an kind of the ultimate example of using perspective, right? I'll show you a slide that demonstrates that, of perspective as well as eye direction. So we've got the disciples. This is Judas. He's looking away, right? But all of the other disciples are looking at Jesus. So our attention is focused on Jesus. Although, remember, anomaly, we focus also our attention on Judas because he's looking a different direction. So this is an example of the other Gestalt principle, which is anomaly. So it's eye directions, but also perspective. 1 point perspective, right? So Jesus' face right in the middle, and all of the lines of the ceiling tiles which he created, or the ceiling indentations. Of course, Jesus is on a lighter background that also helps focus the perspective. But all of this is using perspective to focus on Jesus. An anomaly to focus on Judas. Continuation relates to layout in a magazine, for example, because usually if we have a picture on the page of a person, or in this case an animal, you wouldn't want to have this dog on the right and the layout on the left, because the dog's eye direction is going to take you off the page. So if you've got a person on a page or an animal on a page, have that eye direction pointing into the story. Here's a beautiful example of continuation used in a design in the Nature Conservancy magazine. So we see, we see the word see, but we also see our eye follows this in a way that replicates this undersea foliage, right? This mimics this. Now, I have said in an earlier lecture, let the picture tell you what to do with the design. And this is a clear case of this, because designers have the pictures first. They don't do a layout and then go find the photo. They have their photos, and then they look at the pictures to inspire them and how they should do the design. And this is a beautiful example of looking at a photo and a designer thinking, what can I do with the type that helps replicate this photograph, and even using the gradient colors so that it mimics some of what's happening in the photo, but using continuation, the Gestalt principle of continuation, to move the eye down through the page. So you see the word see, as well as you see a sea green. And finally, among the Gestalt principles, we have closure. Our mind completes familiar objects that are incomplete or not completely closed. Familiar objects, that's key. A dashed line, but our eye completes this and makes a circle. We know instantly it's a circle. That's your brain at work. That's your brain doing its thing. Look at this example of closure. This is amazing. You see a triangle, right? And yet look at how much information is left out. But that triangle is inescapable. It's very powerful. And you might even think that there's some kind of line, faint line that's been drawn here, but there hasn't. Our eye closes, our brains close familiar objects, even if all the information isn't there. Here's an example of closure. The panda from the World Wildlife Federation. Now, this really required a designer to skillfully decide how much information could be left out before the viewer would not any longer be able to understand what something is. So, contingent on closure working is providing enough information so that the brain will enclose it. So there's actually not a ton of space left here, and yet there's enough to put it together and see a panda. Closure. Here's another example of closure. Did you realize there's a peacock in the NBC logo? Well, there is. I think a lot of times when you see it, it flashes by, you don't notice it. But our mind, just by taking a notch out of the purple feather, our mind encloses this part of the bird, because this is the beak and this is the tail. Okay, so that's it for Gestalt. And believe me, there is lots and lots more to know about Gestalt. If you look up Gestalt theory, you're going to find a ton of mind-blowing examples, actually. If you Google figure ground, you're going to find a bunch of mind-blowing examples of how designers are using the ways that the brain works to create designs. But there's another important group of theory that I'm just going to basically cruise over it just to give you enough orientation to understand how it works. And that is semiotic theory. Semiotics is the study of signs. What does this mean? Well, the basics are that a sign is anything that stands for something else. People say, it's a sign. It's a sign of something, right? We see smoke and we know there's fire, or we suspect there's fire. We see clouds, and what we see that representing is a chance for rain. We see a frown on somebody's face or a smile on someone's face, and what that is a sign of to us is people's happiness or unhappiness. And here's how signs work. You have what's called a signifier. So let's say that the signifier is a red light, right? The signified is what you know to do based on the red light. Now, signs are a thing that we have to learn through our lives culturally. We make that mistake, right? We see, when we're children, we may see smoke and not understand fire and go towards something and get burned. But then we understand that smoke means there's something hot in there that's going to hurt us. So now the smoke signifies, the signifier, the smoke, tells us to stop. Same with seeing somebody's angry face, right? When you're, before you learn to associate what you learn, before you will learn to associate the sign with what it's telling you to do, okay, you may make the mistake of approaching someone who looks angry. Or like a dog, you're little, this dog is growling or snarling. You may not understand that that means the dog is probably not, may bite you if you go closer to it. So a dog that's snarling or barking is a sign that you should stay away. So the dog, the signifier, is the dog barking. The signify, the thing it signifies is stop. So a signifier is the sign, and the signified is what the sign tells you or gets you to do. Okay? The signifier is the sign. There are 3 types of signs. Icons, indexes, and symbols. An icon bears some resemblance. So the icon, these images are the signifiers, right? These icons are signifiers that tell you what? It's the men's and women's bathrooms, right? They have a physical resemblance. You don't have to learn what that means. But notice how these icons are used the world over, because people are so attuned to them that they don't have to figure them out. Have you ever gone to a restaurant or someplace and they put something on the bathroom, some piece of art or something that's supposed to tell you whether it's the women's or the men's, but you can't really understand what it is? That is not an icon. Icons provide a service. We know what they mean. We know what they signify. An index is essentially a photograph. The index looks like what the thing is. So the index, which is the signifier, right? These people are the signifier, and the signified is, well, they're people. I mean, we know they're people. We may not know what they're telling us to do, but essentially what I want you to know is that an index looks like what it is. And then we have symbols. With symbols, there's an arbitrary relationship between the signifier and the signified. So the sign gains meaning through social convention. And we have to learn what the signs mean. We can't intuit them. So we learn over time that something represents something. And then we very strongly come to associate it with something else. So the sign, remember, the sign is the signifier. So in each case here, signifier, signifier, signifier. And the signify, what it's telling you to do, might vary depending circumstantially or contextually. So just remember, what I want you to know is an icon looks very close to what it's representing. An index essentially is what it's representing, but symbols have to be learned. And it's the symbol that is very important in branding. These are not brands, but these are all very potent symbols. We know what they mean. The swastika, what does it signify? It signifies evil. It signifies something that it signifies evil, right? If you lived in Nazi Germany and you were Jewish and you saw a swastika, that signifier would make you react in a way. It would make you want to flee. We have the peace sign. We recognize that. And the heart. Now, I'm not going to ask you on a quiz, is this a signifier? But I will want you to know that symbols are very important to branding. Because here we go. In logos. You know what each one of these is. I don't have to tell you, right? Funny how close the Mercedes logo is to the peace sign. And they could not be more different. And the Nike swoosh, which we've learned contextually, right? Like we have learned it culturally, what this stands for. But this is probably this and the Apple, the Apple for Macintosh. Well, the company was Macintosh. And that's why they created an apple. And the bite out of it, everybody wants to attach a lot of meaning to the bite, like Adam or Eve, biting into the forbidden apple. But really, what the designer says was that the notch was put in the apple, the bite was put in the apple just to make it more recognizable. So we've got this Nike swoosh, which these two logos have to be these icons, right? Symbols. I'm sorry, they're not icons, they're symbols. These two symbols have to be two of the most recognized symbols in the world. There probably are places where people would not recognize a Nike swoosh, but I am not sure where those would be. Oh, and this is a sign of the end. So, what I want you to remember is that symbols are powerful, and from a brand marketing context, they are extremely important. And once somebody lands on a good one, they don't change. Most logos don't change. They might be tweaked a little bit, but nobody's going to go and completely change, right? Nobody's going to go and completely change the Nike swoosh. That is going to be around for as long as Nike exists, which will probably be forever. And this is the end of the semester. I could cry right now, but I won't.